The company was one superlative after another. It operated more miles of track than any other American railroad. Its capital investment was more than $3 billion in 1946 money. It was owned by 218,000 stockholders and had the largest gross revenue of any American line. Unlike the Erie, which was famous for not paying dividends, the Pennsylvania had the longest record of annual dividends, 100 years. In its centennial year, the Pennsy was the most important single transportation agency in the world in volume of traffic handled. It operated more than 4,800 locomotives, 240,000 freight cars, and 7,200 passenger cars. Its freight cars would have formed a single train from New York to Chicago and back. Nearly half the country's population then lived in states served by the Pennsylvania, and that was along with more than half of the nation's resources and wealth. That such a gigantic monolith could have disappeared is unthinkable. But much of what was the Pennsy now is operated under other names, principally Conrail and Amtrak. The story of the standard railroad of the world is an enchanting parallel to the development of the nation, a captivating view of the men and machines who produced such a giant. The Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered by the state of Pennsylvania on April 13th of 1846. It was to build a line from Harrisburg through Lewistown to Pittsburgh. Earlier, the state had set up a common carrier, which was called the State Works, consisting not only of railroad tracks, but canals, and even a series of inclined planes over the rugged mountain territory. But the State Works could not compete with the northern route across the miles traversed by the Erie Canal between the East Coast and the Midwest. Through politics and mismanagement, the state route lost money to the point where the Pennsylvania Railroad, now building between Harrisburg and Philadelphia, bought the state's interest. Thus, in 1857, the Pennsylvania had entrance into Philadelphia on its own tracks. It was the beginning of the Pennsylvania's acquisition of other and smaller railroads, which over the years numbered well over 100. Some of these railroads had predated the Pennsylvania, like the Camden and Amboy, famous for its importing from England the early locomotive they called the John Bull. This primitive machine still exists at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. As the Pennsylvania Railroad developed, it would assist other railroads with capital, and often the smaller railroad would become a part of the larger one. Philadelphia and New York were early competitors for the commerce from the Atlantic Ocean, Philadelphia being one of three major eastern seaports along with New York and Baltimore. Because of this competition, the Pennsylvania leaders could not ignore a connection to both cities. So the Pennsy built tracks into Jersey City on the banks of the Hudson River just opposite Manhattan. It then used barges to ferry freight cars across the river. Further, the railroad added Washington, D.C. to its major terminals, despite bitter opposition from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. During the Civil War, the Pennsylvania was one of the northern railroads which played an important part in the waging of that conflict. The South could not match the movement of troops and supplies, and this contributed to the final outcome. One of the early chief engineers on the Pennsy was Herman Haupt. He supervised the Allegheny Tunnel and the completion of the road to Pittsburgh. During the war, General Haupt was in charge of construction for the United States military railroads and was credited with improving the efficiency of the trains needed to support the Union troops. Then, the Pennsylvania was one of the several lines which carried the Lincoln funeral train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. One of the photos of that train was taken during its stop at Harrisburg. Just after the Civil War, the Pennsylvania leased the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad in 1869, thus giving the Pennsy rails from the Hudson River through Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and Fort Wayne to Chicago. The Pensy's entrance into St. Louis was by way of the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and St. Louis Railroad, otherwise known as the Panhandle. On the Panhandle passenger terminal was in the St. Louis Union Station, which over the years also was terminal for several other railroads in that gateway city. By way of the Panhandle, the Pennsy also had a second connection to Chicago, and it was on this portion of the line on Sunday, October 18th of 1903, that two freight trains collided head-on. This took place a mile and a half east of Hebron, Indiana, and contemporary reports say that one of the engineers was killed. In the Panhandle country, the Pennsy acquired the Vandalia line, which ran from St. Louis through Terre Haute to Logansport and South Bend, ending next to the famous Studebaker Wagon Works. A locomotive which was built for the Vandalia line survived its contemporaries and was restored to operation by the Clinchfield Railroad of Tennessee. They dubbed it number 1, and it ran on excursions in the early 1970s. Here, Clinchfield number 1, formerly of the Vandalia, is operating out of Irvine, Tennessee in August of 1972. Pittsburgh was an important point on the Pennsylvania Railroad because it was the hub of the lines from Philadelphia through Fort Wayne to Chicago and the Panhandle to St. Louis. So in the period 1869 to 1873, the Pennsy reached its geographical limits, though not its full growth. This was the same period in which the Vanderbilts were consolidating the New York Central with the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern to form another major rail route from the East Coast to Chicago and the Midwest. While the state of Pennsylvania had large deposits of both oil and coal, this became important as sources of freight for the Pennsy and several other lines, including the Reading, Delaware and Hudson, Lehigh Valley, Lackawanna, and the Central of New Jersey. Now, the Pennsy, like some of the other lines, had to buy into the coal fields to assure itself of a share of the transportation dollars which these commodities generated. One of the great engineering feats carried out by the builders of the Pennsylvania Railroad was the way they managed to push their tracks through the mountains. Most notable of these is the famous Horseshoe Curve. J. Edgar Thompson was the engineer who, by 1854, pushed the rails over the Alleghenies. His surveyor staked out the curve which wound back around the mountainside so that the grade was only 92 feet per mile. That trackage exists today and has become one of the most photographed sections of track in the United States. Thompson also was president of the railroad between 1852 and 1874. A contemporary account published in 1903 spoke of the relocation of the tracks through the mountains. It said, "The roadbed has been shifted to new sites, the mountains have been cleaved in two, and the topography of the land altered, seemingly regardless of expense, to a suitable path for the modern locomotive. The result of all this work will be the greatest railroad in the world. 4 tracks the entire distance from New York to Pittsburgh, 6 tracks for a considerable portion of the way, and 2 auxiliary roads relieving sections where traffic is densest, present physical equipment that is matchless in the history of railroads." Just east of Horseshoe Curve is the city of Altoona, where the railroad had built a great shops complex, which by 1873 could build a locomotive from the track up. And it did. The first year, it built number 155. The Juniata shops, as they were known at Altoona, consisted of 125 buildings on 218 acres of land. It was here in 1905 that the first locomotive test plant was established, allowing the railroad's engineering personnel to observe and measure the characteristics of each engine or added component. New or altered locomotives were tested here throughout the steam era. President Thompson was succeeded by Thomas A. Scott, who had to contend with the financial panic of 1873, which, it is believed, was a partial cause of Thompson's death. But prior to becoming president, Scott had been an active participant with Thompson in expanding the Pennsylvania Railroad to its geographic limits. The most important terminal improvement of the Scott years was extending tracks from West Philadelphia to downtown and the building of the Broad Street Station. This was begun in 1880, completed in 1881. This replaced the West Philadelphia station, which had been constructed for the crowds expected at the nation's centennial year, 1876. By 1886, nearly all of the main line between New York and Harrisburg was 4-tracked. By the end of the 19th century, British interests held major shares of stock in the Pennsylvania Railroad, but this was mostly for investment reasons. They didn't try to influence operating decisions. For For much of the first 100 years, the company's financial status was sound, commanding respect both at home and abroad. In 1866, steel rails were replacing the previously used iron rails, a fact which allowed both heavier trains and faster speeds. This, plus the substitution of steel for iron in locomotive design, along with the introduction of the Westinghouse air brake, brought about more speed, more safety, and less cost in maintenance. By far, the greatest emergency the Pennsylvania Railroad had faced in its early years was the Johnstown flood of 1889. The South Fork of the Conemaugh River had been dammed by the state works to provide water for the canals, which in those early days augmented the rail lines. Heavy rains in late May caused the water in the reservoir behind the dam to rise rapidly. On the 31st, the earthen dam gave way, sending a 20-foot-high wall of water cascading down the Conemaugh Valley, shoving everything ahead of it. 15 million tons of water. The Pennsylvania tracks into Johnstown paralleled the riverbed for some 10 miles so that the railroad took heavy damage in roadbed and equipment. 3 trains had been held at Johnstown because of other washouts along the line, and when the wall of water hit, 30 passengers lost their lives. In Johnstown itself, some 2,500 other people lost their lives as more than 1,600 homes were destroyed. The Pennsy lost 24 passenger cars, 561 freight cars, and 34 locomotives. All available forces were sent to restore the railroad, and in 8 days, enough track had been relayed to allow passenger trains to run once more on the Philadelphia and Erie line as a detour. One of the early railroads, which later became a part of the Pennsylvania, was the Madison and Indianapolis, whose problem was a 7,000-foot grade, which rose 310 feet to the mile. First horses, then cog locomotives hauled the freight up the Ohio River bank from Madison, Indiana. Then in 1858, the multi-drivered locomotive Reuben Wells, with 44-inch wheels, was the first adhesion engine to do the job. Named after its designer, it worked for over 30 years. Through the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, the Hudson River was the barrier which kept Pennsylvania trains out of the city's center in Manhattan. As the new century dawned, President Alexander Cassatt brought his executive and engineering ability to bear on the problem. He appointed a committee of engineers to eventually tunnel under the river and develop an electric locomotive which would pull heavy trains in the tunnels, which necessarily had heavy grades at each end. The DD-1 was developed following exhaustive tests, and the fabulous Penn Station in Manhattan was constructed. When it opened in November of 1910, it was the largest through station in the world. It had been designed along classical lines and was used by not only the Pennsylvania, but several other railroads. It was the Penn Station that was the pride of the railroad and for generations a landmark in New York. The masonry work consisted of 47,000 tons of granite, 15 million bricks, and 27,000 tons of steel. Under the station were 16 miles of tracks for both Pennsy and Long Island trains, as well as those of other railroads. One of the world's largest waiting rooms was the main concourse, measuring 277 by 103 feet, with a 100-foot-high ceiling. There were 2 other waiting rooms designed to separate passengers using either the Pennsy or Long Island trains. The cost of building the station and the tunnels under both the Hudson and East Rivers came to $115 million in 1910 money. President Cassatt's sudden death in December of 1906 prevented him from seeing the blossoming of the great project which he initiated. The Long Island Railroad had been taken over by the Pennsy in 1900 so that electric-hauled trains could run from Manhattan Transfer, New Jersey, to Penn Station in Manhattan, and then on to the Long Island tracks and the huge Sunnyside Yard on Long Island. With additional tunnels under the East River, this also allowed a direct rail connection with the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad by way of the Hellgate Bridge, providing a direct connection to New England. The Hellgate Bridge was a colossus when it was constructed, 4 tracks wide, 1,000 feet long, and 135 feet above high water. The Pennsylvania first bought stock in the New Haven in expectation of the Hellgate connection, and it maintained close and valuable traffic ties with that railroad for many years. At one time or another, the Pennsy held large blocks of stock in the Wabash, the Pere Marquette, and the Norfolk and Western. The Ann Arbor Railroad was an interchange route for the Pennsy in Michigan. In 1923, the Pennsylvania reached Detroit with trackage rights over the Wabash and Pere Marquette, but that wasn't good enough. Illustrative of some of the ways the Pennsylvania Railroad bought into or controlled other lines were the events surrounding the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad. This was a line which had been put together in 1905 and had come to a virtual collapse when Henry Ford took over the railroad in 1920. Under his management, it became profitable. It also had valuable terminal facilities in the Detroit area. In 1929, the Pennsylvania stockholders formed a separate corporation they called the Penn Road. Now, this was an effort to protect the Pennsy stockholders from other investors who might want to carry out projects which would be damaging to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Indeed, Penn Road was formed to purchase shares in other substantial rail properties which could benefit the Pennsy lines. One of the first purchases by the new Penn Road Corporation was the DT&I. From the Detroit terminals, the DT&I ran south past Toledo to the Ohio River at Ironton, crossing all the east-west rail lines. So the DT&I was essentially a Pennsylvania subsidiary, owned as it was by the same stockholders who also owned the Pennsy. Later, the DT&I was sold by the Conrail Corporation to the Grand Trunk Western in 1980. The first great bridge project carried out by Pennsylvania engineers was the structure across the Susquehanna River a few miles above Harrisburg and known as the Rockville Bridge. The first bridge was wooden. It was destroyed by fire in 1868. The second bridge was an iron truss affair, but it was replaced by the present Stone Arch Bridge in 1902. Now, this structure carried 4 tracks over 48 spans, each span being 70 feet long, which, with approaches, made a structure of 3,828 feet. The largest freight classification yard was reached by way of the Rockville Bridge. The Enola Yard was built in the early 1900s and was a part of the improvement program of President Alexander J. Cassatt. Just before World War II, Enola handled some 10,000 freight cars on peak days, and during the war, that number doubled. Both steam and electric locomotives were used here. The solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean by Charles Lindbergh in 1927 electrified the whole world. President Calvin Coolidge authorized Lindbergh's return to the United States aboard the Navy cruiser Memphis. The ship sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River, docking at the Washington Navy Yard. The homecoming ceremonies were covered by the newsreel companies, who then had to get their films back to New York for distribution to the nation's theaters. International News chartered a Pennsylvania train, whereas the other newsreels hired an airplane to fly the negatives to New York for processing. The Pennsylvania train, on the other hand, was fitted with a baggage car which had been equipped with processing tanks and printing machines so that the film could be ready for taking to the theaters on Broadway as soon as the train arrived. Pensy's Atlantic-type locomotive 460, a high-wheeled speedster, hauled the baggage car in one coach at speeds of 100 miles an hour at times. The run from Washington Union Station to Penn Station in New York got the processed film to the theaters, allowing international films a scoop on the other newsreels. That locomotive, 460, still exists at the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum at Strasburg. Chicago's Union Station, finished in 1925, was one of several in which the Pennsylvania was a part owner. 50% belonged to the Pennsylvania system, while 25% each was owned by the Burlington and the Milwaukee Road. The Alton used the station as a tenant. There were 14 tracks on the south side, 10 on the north side, with 3 tracks running alongside the south branch of the Chicago River, bypassing the station for switching purposes. At one time, some 40% of all mail handled by the railroads in Chicago passed through Union Station. And like many of the grand railroad terminals of the period, the building was mammoth. In the spring of 1928, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Transcontinental Air Transport Company began a joint venture in which it could carry passengers from coast to coast in 48 hours. Passengers used the train at night and the plane by day. West of Chicago, the nights were spent aboard a Santa Fe train. But the service didn't last long, despite the fact that it was promoted by the 2 best-known flyers of the day, Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. By October of 1930, the airline had established a 36-hour trip, the passengers staying overnight in Kansas City. Then in November of 1932, the trip included night flying, the trip taking only 24 hours. TAT became Transcontinental and Western, which later became Trans World Airlines. This was the beginning of the end for large numbers of passengers using the railroads for coast-to-coast travel. And it forecast the doom of the long-distance passenger train operated by the privately owned railroads. But probably the most famous class of all Pennsylvania locomotives, rivaled only by the GG1 electrics, was the K class. The K4s, a 4-6-2-wheel arrangement known on all railroads as a Pacific, hauled the lion's share of the Pensy's latter-day passenger trains during the steam era. It was a well-proportioned, fast-hauling machine. As passenger trains got heavier and schedules tighter, the K4s often had to be double-headed. It was in the late 1920s that the competing New York Central produced its famous Hudson locomotive, their J-class. Pennsy came up with a similar engine and enlarged K4, which they classed a K5. But the railroad never really got with the K5. As early as 1895, the Pennsylvania had experimented with electric traction. Then the electrification of the Hudson River Tunnel from Jersey to Manhattan showed the desirability of electric propulsion. And the railroad announced in 1912 it was going to electrify several of its suburban lines out of its Broad Street station in Philadelphia. This was to relieve the serious congestion at the station, the suburban trains being able to go either direction without the need to turn a steam locomotive. Added to that was the quicker acceleration the electrics possessed. Eventually, 524 of the multiple-unit suburban cars were in use by the railroad. During the Depression, the federal government loaned the Pennsy money to electrify long-distance routes. Through-service electrics began between New York and Washington in 1935. The cost of the wires, supports, substation, and track changes came to $87 million in Depression-era dollars. Another $39 million was spent for locomotives. Thus, the 1,400 miles of electrified trackage made the Pennsy by far the largest operator of electric trains. Like other major railroads in the nation and overseas, the Pennsylvania had its name trains, many of which were justly famous. Right around 1880, the Pennsylvania Limited made the trip from Jersey City to Chicago in 26 hours and 40 minutes. By 1902, the Pennsylvania Special made the run in an even 20 hours. Later, in 1905, the Special was carted at 18 hours. In 1912, the Pennsylvania Special's name was changed to the Broadway Limited. Running times of the two trains were shortened as the years went by to where they were making the New York to Chicago run in 15 and a half hours. While dieselization reduced the otherwise expanding cost of operation, it was not enough, and costs continued to escalate. At the same time, competition from federally subsidized highways and airlines began to cut into the operation of the railroads. Truck lines began to haul the time-oriented and high-tariff freight, leaving the railroads to handle more and more of the bulk commodities like coal and grain. The airlines took away the long-distance passenger, and the private automobile and superhighway took most of the rest. Much has been written on the decline in the importance of railroad transportation. For the Pennsylvania, it seemed that it was such a huge organization it could not adjust rapidly enough, and disaster loomed. For nearly a century and a quarter, the Pennsylvania Railroad had been the giant transportation machine in the eastern half of the nation. Its glory now is remembered in books and photographs and films. But the lines it built in the east and through the mountains remain. Conrail and Amtrak still run in the electrified corridor in Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, with trains still running to Boston. The lines through the mountains still are used by Conrail, although the west end of the line from Fort Wayne to Chicago was being downgraded in late 1990. Conrail and Amtrak using the old New York Central water level route into the Windy City. But the actions of the men and machines of the Pennsylvania Railroad remain a tremendous story, a proud part of the history of the building of the United States of America.